Hello everyone, I'm Maria Thakur and we're going to talk today about competing for resources. In the last lecture, I discussed with you how animals access resources. And when I was doing that, I considered a forager accessing resources alone without competition. But animals and plants, in fact, compete. They compete for these resources. And to do that for many reasons. When animals compete, they're competing for food, mates, places to refuge from predators. And one way for them to do that is to exploit space. Before I start talking about models and ways to predict space exploitation, let's first separate competition into two types. One is intraspecific competition, which is competition between individuals of the same species. And the other is interspecific competition, which is competition between individuals of different species. Today I want to begin by focusing on intraspecific competition, so we follow directly from the accessing resources lecture. You will hear a lot more about interspecific competition later on. Competition itself, competition for space and resources, can influence the distribution of animals in the environment. So here are three different kinds of distributions. A uniform distribution, a random distribution, and a clumped distribution. And so these are different ways that animals of the same population, in other words, the same species, distribute themselves in space. And we actually, by measuring the distribution patterns, we can infer what kind of competition is occurring in the species, if at all. I'll come back to this slide at the very end of the talk. So let's begin first with a hypothetical scenario to predict the neutral model of distribution. So suppose there are two habitats. One is rich, which means it has high resources, and another is poor. It has low resources. And as the forager forages in these environments, the resources deplete as they're used. Now this should sound familiar, like the marginal value theorem, where the gain curve would slow down the longer a forager spends in the environment. Now let me start by giving you the assumptions right away. Let's assume that the forager in this environment has no territories. They don't fight directly, and there's no limit to the number of competitors that can exploit the resource or the habitat. What this means is that individuals are free to move between the rich patch and the poor patch and vice versa, so that they can exploit the habitat where it gets the highest payoff. I'm using a new term here, payoff, but really what I mean is the highest rate of consumption, which is the same as what we were talking about when we discussed accessing resources. It's the highest energy gain per unit time foraging. So let's predict how a competitor or a population of competitors should distribute themselves in the environment. So in this graph, on the x-axis is the number of competitors in the population. And think about the competitors coming into a habitat one after the other. On the y-axis is how much energy can be gained by that individual in that habitat. Right? So we're calling this rewards per individual, but it could be energy gain. So in the rich patch, this is what a curve would look like. The first competitor who comes in gets a high resource because no other competitors are there. The second individual that comes in also has a high resource because now it's only competing with one other individual in that habitat, and so on and so forth. But I started by saying imagine a world where you've got rich habitat and a poor habitat. Now notice here, the poor habitat has the same rewards per individual curve, however, it starts lower because the poor habitat has fewer resources than the rich habitat. So what should a competitor do? Right? If these two habitats are empty and individuals are coming in one at a time, right? The first individual should go to the rich habitat because it gives him a higher payoff than the poor habitat. The second individual should also go to the rich habitat. So should the third and fourth and fifth, because up to this point you still see that if a forager has a choice between the rich habitat and the poor habitat, it should still pick the rich one because it gives it a higher payoff than if it stopped and got resources at the poor habitat. So we can predict, we can predict how many individuals should end up in the rich habitat and how many should end up in the poor habitat. At this point, on the x-axis, the number of competitors, now there's a decision to be made. If the competitors chose the rich habitat, it would get a resource value that's there. But it could also be the first individual that arrives in the poor habitat, rather than being the 8th or 9th or 10th individual in the rich habitat. Because the resources gained in the rich habitat and the poor habitat are now the same. So in this scenario, we can fill habitats based on their quality in a form that's called the ideal free distribution. The result of the ideal free distribution is the following. Competitors should adjust their distribution in relation to the habitat quality. At equilibrium, which means at the end when all individuals have arrived and are now settled, every individual has the same rate of resource acquisition. This means that individuals have a resource matching rule, that the resources gained by everybody in habitat 1 would be the same as the resources gained by everybody in habitat 2. So R1 over N1, R is a number of the amount of resources, N1 is a number of individuals, will be the same in all habitats. So the ideal free distribution is a theoretical pattern of distribution of competitors between resource patches or between habitats. Again, they're not directly competing, they're just filling that space. And they will fill their space based on how much resources they get, divided by how many individuals are in here. Ideal free distribution assumes a few things, like all models. It assumes that individuals are free to go where they will do best, which means they are achieving the highest resource gain rate. There's no exclusion of weaker competitors by stronger ones. That's what the free means in the ideal free distribution. Individuals have complete information about the availability of resources. That's what the ideal means in the IFD. Now, IFD has been tested many times, and I'll show you two examples. One was done by Milinski in 1979, where he put 6 stickleback fish in a tank. And the one side of the tank was labeled side A, and the other side was labeled side B. So at the start of his experiment, you'll notice that 3 fish were on one side, and that means 3 fish was on the other. Right? The y-axis is the number of fish at side A. So at time x, which is here, what Milinski did was give side B, drop food from side B at a rate that was 2 times more than the food he dropped in side A. What happened is the fish readjusted themselves in the tank so that there were now 2 fish on side A and 4 fish on side B. Side B had 2 times more food than side A. And that's what's happening in this part of the graph. So if at point X, when he put 2 types of food on one side, fish shifted there, leaving 2 behind here and 4 on that side. And then he switched it again. At time Y, he gave side A 2 times more food than side B. And the fish readjusted, and now there are 4 fish on side A and 2 fish on side B. So the fish were moving in the tank such that at the end of each set of trials, the number of fish matched the resource amount. R over N was the same on side A and side B. The outcome is all fish had the same rate of food intake. Harper in 1982 tested this out in the wild with mallard ducks in a pond. And he did the same thing that was done with the sticklebacks in the tanks in the lab. He dropped food from one side of the pond versus another and varied how much was provided. So in this first graph, side A was given, or site A, one side of the pond, was given 2 times more food than side B, at which point 22 ducks were on the side that has more food and 11 ducks were on the side that had less food. And then he switched it. Side B was given 2 times more food than side A, and again the ducks shifted so that now side B had 22 ducks and side A had 11 ducks. Again, the same thing happened here. The outcome is that all ducks had the same rate of food accessible to them. Now, the stable distribution of fish and ducks in both these experiments can be achieved 2 ways. One is that competitor numbers adjust so that the resource matching rule holds, which means everybody gets the same rate of energy gain divided by the total number that's there. Or all individuals can visit both patches, but each spends more time in the good patch than the poor patch, right? So in both these examples, there was 2 times more food on one side versus another, right? And so the ducks and the fish could spend twice as much time on one side versus another. What Milinski noticed when his fish were moving back and forth was a perfect match to ideal feed distribution. But what Harper noticed with ducks was that not all ducks got the same amount of food, because not all ducks were equal competitors. So we actually have to think about the fact that the ideal feed distribution should reflect a condition where competitors are not equal. So some individuals may be better competitors than others, and dominant individuals could outcompete subordinate individuals. So can we tell the difference between a population with equal versus unequal competitors? This is tricky. It actually can be difficult to distinguish based on the numerical predictions alone, which is the R over N rule, resource matching rule. So Sutherland and Parker, shortly after ideal feed distribution was first developed, modified it to include aggression. And I'll just talk to you about why that's important. So imagine this scenario where we have fish in an environment, and one side of the environment has food that's available to them at twice the rate, which is up here, versus the other. We'd expect from the ideal feed distribution model that there should be 8 fish on the side that has 2x food and 4 fish on the side that has 1x food, if all competitors were equal. So the numerical prediction is we have twice as many fish on one side than the other. If competitors are unequal, so we can depict that here in the cartoon as big fish and small fish, where the big fish eat twice as much food as the small fish. Then you can imagine a scenario like this, where you may have equal number of fish on both sides of this habitat, except that one side has big fish that eat twice the amount of food, and the other side has small fish that eat half the amount of food. Of course, we can have all these various combinations of big fish and small fish if we allow unequal competitors to exist in our model. What you'll notice is that actually there are many ways in which you could get the same ratio of fish on one side and the other, even if it was unequal competitors. So our equal competitors scenario has 8 fish on one side, 4 fish on the other. In our unequal competitors side, we still have 8 fish on one side and 4 on the other, but those 8 fish is a combination of small and big fish. So actually, we might see in an environment you have 8 fish on one side and 4 on the other and conclude that's equal competitors, but it could be unequal competitors, and we wouldn't know unless competitive advantage was obvious like this, where they were big or small. So we actually now have to think of a situation that allows resource defense, which the ideal free distribution on its own doesn't. So let's modify the ideal free distribution, IFD, with competitors that are unequal. So we still have our 2 habitats, which is a rich habitat and a poor habitat, and competitors occupy the rich habitat first, and they defend territories. In doing so, they don't allow subordinates to come into the environment. So now we can draw this rich habitat, poor habitat in a slightly different way. Right? On the x-axis is the number of competitors like before, and the y-axis is the number of individuals that can gain access to resources in each of these habitats. Right? So it's not the rate gain, but a number of individuals that get to be in that habitat. So the first competitor that comes to the environment should go to the rich habitat. So should the second and third and fourth, so on, until this point, at which point the rich habitat is full, because all that whole habitat is now filled with competitors that are defending space. And so the rich habitat cannot hold any more individuals. And so the next individual that comes into the environment has to go to the poor habitat. And so from this point on, the poor habitat fills up until that point at which the poor habitat is also full. And then there's no space left in either the rich or poor habitats. Unlike ideal free distribution, IFD, with equal competitors, right, we predicted there that at equilibrium, everybody has the same energy over time, or energy over n, number of individuals. But with IFDD, which is unequal competitors, those in the rich habitat still get higher food gain than those in the poor. So this has been tested several times. One is an empirical example I want to describe here is by birds, great tits that live in the oak woodlands of the United Kingdom. Crabs noticed that at the beginning of spring, birds first set up territories in the oak habitat. So the woods that had a high resource was the rich habitat, was the forest. And once the forest was filled up, birds had no choice but to go to the poor habitat. And these are these hedges that were along the sides of roads, which is less good than the rich habitat. But the rich habitat, once it fills up, no longer has space for birds, and so now they have to move to the poor habitat. And when that's full, there are no territories left to be had, and those individuals either have to disperse or are outcompeted entirely. So if animals, like birds, for example, actually defend territories, we must have think about the economics associated with territory defense. The benefits are clear, right? As was the benefits we discussed before: access to resources, food, nest sites, safety, and even mates. But with the ideal free distribution, we're saying access is all you get. With territory defense, you have exclusive access, because you're preventing others from accessing the resources you have. So the benefits are clear. What are the costs of territory defense? There are quite a few. There's the energy to defend the territory. There's time spent defending the territory. There's risk of injury, increased exposure to predation or elements. So it's not trivial to think about when to have territories and how big the territory should be, given the number of costs and the intensity of these costs. So let's use the economic model in the same way that we had before and think about territoriality. So territoriality should be favored by selection when the benefits outweigh the costs. So now the question to ask is, how large should a territory be? So imagine on the x-axis is territory size that can vary from very small to very large, and the y-axis can either be the benefits or the costs. So let's think about how we draw benefits first. A small territory would give some benefits. And as territory size increases, more and more benefits are gained. But after a while, that should also taper off, because a big territory won't give you so many benefits than a smaller territory once you've maximized all the resources you need. So a benefit curve will decelerate. The cost curve will also increase over time. Small territories are easier to defend, but as territory size increases, it gets harder and harder to defend a territory. So costs will also increase in a slightly different way. It will increase more rapidly than the benefits do. So let's take this approach, the cost and benefit curves associated with a territory of varying sizes, and ask, what is the optimal territory size? What is the highest benefit with the lowest cost? And that's this point that I indicate here. This is the highest benefit to cost. And so for a species that has a cost curve that looks like this and a benefit curve that looks like this, territory size should be there. So territory size depends on both benefits and cost in the same optimality approach that we had used before. So now we can use this to think about the environment and the ways that different things can change. So we can imagine a scenario where habitats are either rich or poor. The cost curve is the same, which means to defend a territory, all that energy and time spent is reflected in the same curve. But if you're a rich habitat, you have more resources if your territory is big than if you're a poor habitat. So can we predict what the territory size would be in rich and poor habitats? Yes, we can. In the rich habitat, territory size should be smaller than in the poor habitat. That's because in the rich habitat, an animal can get more resources per cost at a smaller territory than in the poor habitat, where the resources are not as good, so they need a larger territory to get enough given the costs. So when you vary the benefit, we can predict how large a territory should be. We can also vary the costs. By keeping the benefits the same, we can have territory defense either be easier, which is a low cost, or it can be harder, which is a high cost. And again, we can predict what a forager should do in terms of how big the territory needs to be. So in an environment that has a high cost, territories should be small. And in environments where the cost to territory defense is low, territories can be large. So we can use this graphical approach to think about how large a territory should be, given the costs and benefits. Now, I want to come back to this figure that I showed you at the very beginning, or this illustration that I showed you at the beginning, which has different types of distributions. Right? You can see here the uniform distribution has animals spacing themselves out. Penguins are a good example of having a uniform distribution in their environment, and that's because they defend territories. In a random distribution, where you have some individuals close together and some further apart, we don't expect territory defense. We still expect competition, but not territory defense. And an example of this would be plants that are wind dispersed. Finally, if you see an animal or a plant that has clumped distribution, this suggests that the group of individuals that are clumped don't have competition with each other, but they could have competition with other groups that are also clumped. So clumped distribution could be an outcome of territoriality between clumps. Elephants are a good example of them, because elephants form family groups and so therefore are found in clumps, but those clumps defend territories and are apart. So we can infer the type of competition and whether or not there's territoriality from distribution patterns of animals in the wild. As before, plants also compete for resources, which means not only do they need to access resources, they're competing with each other for resources. Nutrients, water, and light are the three main classes of resources for plants. Carbon dioxide can also limit plant growth, but it's thought that atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is very large and well mixed, and so therefore plants are not expected to compete for carbon dioxide. So we can look at the traits plants have to infer about what is the limiting competitive. So to have competitive advantage, certain traits are selected in individuals. So for example, if the habitat has nutrient limitation and that plants of the same species are competing with each other for nutrients, what you'd find is that individuals will grow longer roots so that they can access nutrients better. If you're in an environment where light competition is high, then we'd expect to see plants that are taller with flatter canopies. So what we can do is infer the limiting resource that leads to competition based on the traits that plants exhibit. Another really good example of intraspecific competition in plants is seed dispersal. So seeds disperse from their parent plant because they're trying to reduce the resource competition with their parent plant. And so evolution has shaped a range of seed dispersal strategies, from wind to food, from wind to animal vectors, so that seeds can disperse away from the plants and reduce the competition with each other. With that, I want to wrap this lecture and give you a few things to think about. In both animals and plants, phenotypic responses to intraspecific competition can arise in two ways. One, natural selection over evolutionary time through persistent competition has shaped phenotypic traits that allow some individuals to have a better competitive advantage than another. Alternatively, you could have plants and animals induce a response over the lifetime of over their own lifetime. So for example, a species can defend territories, but how large that territory is is determined by that individual in that environment and not shaped over evolutionary time. So the size of a territory is an induced response. So we should think about what kinds of traits would yield competitive advantage if process 1, the evolution process, shaped those traits, or if process 2, induction, adaptation at the individual life scale, shaped those traits. And do these processes, process 1 and 2, interact, and in what way? With that, that ends my lecture on competing for resources.